Hello everyone, my name is Uma Ashok and I'm going to be talking about on how to access the stored procedure using the Informatica Data Access Service. Informatica Data Access Service is provided as an offering with the product Informatica Cloud Application Integration, which is formerly ICRT. Now, with Data Access Service, it is possible to interact directly with any data source, but within a business process execution language process using the Data Access System service. Now, using the service, you can create an activity that runs one or more SQL statements and on a specified data source and receives a result as the response. You could process the response using your client, or you could process the response using an Informatica process, which is created as part of the process designer. Now, what are the different use cases that you would use the data access service? The Informatica Cloud Real-Time Designer, also known as the Cloud Application Integration Designer, provides a way to query the database for simple conditions. For instance, if you want to find out the list of records which matches a specific condition, say ID equals XYZ, then you would get the list of objects that matches that, or you can even get the one single object that matches the specific condition. Whereas if you need to query for some complex SQL statements that involves multiple join conditions, for example, or if you want to execute a SQL stored procedure that contains your own business logic, then you would want to use the data access service. The other condition wherein you would use the data access service is if you have to perform some operations for bulk number of records, say a conditional update or delete. You could use the Informatica process developer and the data access service together to perform the conditional updates and deletes. Now, what are the basic requirements to invoke a stored procedure? This, since this specific example is going to be dealing with invoking a stored procedure in the data access service, let's look at the basic requirements to what you would need in order to be able to accomplish this operation. So as first of all, you would need to configure the data access configuration within the process console. So you would need a database compatible driver to be placed on the system class path within the agent, or a location that is accessible to the agent. Compatible driver would mean that, for example, if you're using an Oracle 12, you would need an OJDBC6.jar or OJDBC7.jar. Now, you would also need access to the Informatica Cloud Real-Time Process Console to configure the data access service. You would get an access to the process console as long as you are an administrator of the Informatica org. You would need to download the Informatica process developer to be able to create a people process and subsequently invoke the data access service. The download to the process developer is available from the Informatica Process Central. And you would need a stored procedure, a working example of a stored procedure, to make sure that the stored procedure works outside the Informatica and to make sure that the results match what you need. You would also need the access to the database to be able to verify the updates that the stored procedure is supposed to perform. Now, quickly going through the steps that is involved in designing the data access service is you would first of all go to the Informatica process console and define a JDBC data source under the specific location as mentioned here, and you have an option to configure and you have an option to even test whether the data source works. And then followed by you have to create a Informatica process developer process, which is a people process, which uses the data access service as the partner service provider. And once you finish developing that, you would need to make sure that you're pointing to the JNDI of the data source that was performed as part of the step 1. You would need to deploy the developer process that you just created to the secure agent. Make sure that you have a wrapper process on the cloud to be able to invoke the process down the secure agent. Alternatively, you could invoke the process on the secure agent directly using a URL The only requirement is the agent should be publicly accessible, or the firewall in the agent must be open. But if you do not have the option of opening up the firewall, we can do that work by, if you just create a simple wrapper process on the cloud to be able to invoke the secure agent process. After these steps, you would just invoke the cloud process from the designer process as part of the service call step. Alternatively, when you create a wrapper process over a visitor interface, you could invoke them over a service connector within the process designer. Now over to a demo of the actual set of steps that is needed. As you see on the console, you could find the data source service listed under the agent console and under the admin and under the data source service. Please note that the data source service will not be available when your console is chosen as a cloud server. We do not allow any configuration of the data access service in the cloud server. Now, within the data source configuration, you would need to give a data source name. This can be anything, and you'll have to give a Jindy path. Again, this path doesn't have to be anything specific, but as a best practice, you can follow the format of JDBC / and whatever is your name of the data source or the kind of database that you're connecting to. The driver class, for example, is in this case is Oracle JDBC.driver.Oracle driver, as that's what the native Oracle driver supports. And the URL will have the URL of the database server with the service at its end. And the username and password is what your database administrator has given to access the specific tables under that the user has permissions to. Once you finish configuring the data source service, you have an option to test the connection. As you can see, the connection is successfully validated. And once you update the connection by clicking on the update button, you should see the data source service is completely accessible. So here is an entry that I just created with Oracle, JDBC Oracle, and Oracle JDBC driver, Oracle driver. Now switching to the Informatica process developer, here is the Informatica process developer wherein you will be creating the project to be able to access the data access service. So as a first Beeple service, I would create the orchestration project with a simple name. For instance, I would just create as you could see that as soon as you create a project, you get a predefined template of the different folders wherein you have to put your files. I wouldn't be creating new files now. Rather, I would just walk with the example with what is created before for the purpose of showing this on this demo. So I created a simple project here, and all this project does is it has a reference to a data access common wherein I have specified a schema and a WSDL pertaining to the data access WSDL and the schema. And later refer to this project, the data access common project within the data access agent. Now the data access agent process will need to have request and a response, which is what you would create by going into the participants, the process service consumer, new process service consumer, and picking in the exec SQL or exec multi-SQL, whichever is the relevant operation. Now note that this data access partner link or the interface is something that you have got as part of the reference that you made to the common project. As soon as you get the process consumer defined here, you would need to define the request and the response. All I do here is I would drag and drop the exec SQL operation to the canvas and something like this, and this should create a request and a reply pair. I can then go and edit the properties of this specific receive to give any name that I need. But the interesting thing to notice, it would have filled in all the other important fields such as participant, operation, and it would have just left the activity of you filling in the required single variable. Again, I'm not going to be saving this process. I'm just showing the steps that one would do when they start from the scratch. Now, once you have a request and the reply pair, the reply pair is just going to give you a reply back to the client, whoever is going to call that. Let me just delete this. Now, here is the important thing. Here is how you create the data access service by right mouse click, and then there are a bunch of services under the system services, and the one that you would need to take is the data access. Doesn't matter whatever you choose from within these two operations. As soon as you create one, you're going to see both these operations, and I'm going to be pulling in execute multi-SQL because if you look at the logic that I have here, I am going to be creating a stored procedure, and I am going to be calling the stored procedure with the specific parameters in here. I'm passing in 3 parameters. The first one is property name, the second one is property value, and the third one is an out parameter, which is the result. And then I'm going to be dropping the procedure that I created. As you can see, I'm taking the very first parameter as the input that I'm getting to this process, and the second one is a static ID that I have configured now, but again this is parameterizable. You can get this from input, and the third parameter here is going to return the result. Now my procedure contains 2 simple SQL statements. One, it's going to update the employee table with the first name that you're setting, and second one is going to return the count of star of the total rows from the table. And as part of the response, I'm simply sending whatever response I get from the data access service back to the service that it is calling it. Let me not save this. Now, once I have created that data access service project, now I would have to create a deployment descriptor. In this case, I'm calling this as .pdd. And the important thing to note here is the GIND name that you specify. This is the GIND name that should match with whatever GIND path that you have given for the data source. And the process consumer here will have a service name, and I'm allowing as an anonymous access for anyone to be able to call this service. Now, once I have created the project, I would deploy this by right mouse click and then export, performing the contribution business archive, and then it would create the beeper. When I finish, it's going to create the data access agent.beeper. Now, if you remember the steps that I iterated before, this process is directly callable via the HTTP URI directly, provided your secure agent has the firewall open for anyone from external network to be able to call in. If not, you don't have to worry about it. You just have to create a simple wrapper process on top of it and just call them, and then just call the actual process, which is executing the data access service, as a subprocess. So in this example, all I'm doing is I'm calling, I have created an automated step process, which is called the, so here is how you would create the automated step. You go to the process service consumer, again as part of the system service, and you would just choose the automated step here. And this is going to call, and this is going to be filling in some of the important parameters within the sequence. Now, once you're done with it, so you create an automated step, and from the automated step, I'm passing the required input parameters to call the to call the other process that I created and pass the information into the actual data access service. So in other words, this is just going to be a simple wrapper process that sits on top of the actual agent process that does the data access service call. And we need this process that would be deployed on the cloud server and would expose a URL for anyone to be able to invoke it. The other way of also using this automated step process is once you have created a process that has a receive on the automated step, it is going to be visible from the Informatica Cloud Process Designer as a service call step, which is what I would demonstrate in just a minute. All right, so I'm not going to be saving this process, closing down this process. Now, once I have created the respective BPRs, I would have to deploy the respective BPRs, which is called the Business Process Archive, to the process console. So I go to the process console, I would click on deploy. I would choose to deploy the agent process first, which will have the path. And choose to deploy it on the agent, and then just click on deploy. It's going to deploy that to the agent. Similarly, choose the wrapper process, which is the cloud process, to be able to deploy under the cloud directly. For the purpose of demo, I'm not deploying now because I already have this deployed to the servers. Now comes the execution part of it. So how do I execute the data access service? So I log into the Informatica Cloud. I go to the design service and processes. I've already created a simple designer process and have shown the steps on how you would invoke it. Now, an important thing to note back in the cloud-based process here is there is something called services.xml. So whenever you have a process that is based out of the automated step, which is what I demonstrated initially, out of this automated step, you need to be able to deploy a file by name services.xml and provide some basic details in it. So the basic details here is the service name. The service name will be equivalent to what you have defined within the data access.pdd. And you would have to give a display name and then the description. They are all the static text. The other important information is what is the input that you're going to be sending in and what is the output that you're going to be receiving as part of the response. The reason for invoking this service, reason for defining the services.xml is for the cloud server to perform an auto discovery of the deployed service and show them as part of the step within the process designer. So as you can see, there is an action that lists the name of the procedure that the display name of the process that we gave as part of the services.xml. Now, as soon as you pull that specific service call step, as soon as you see the execute stored procedure and then fill them in, you would also see the input and output that you have defined as part of the services.xml. So this specific case, I'm going to be giving an input to the process because my input, I have specified my input as a type of string. I'm feeding in the input to the process, and based on whatever it's going to respond back, which is the output or response, I am going to show this as the output of this entire Beeple process. That's it. Now, how do I execute this process? Once I create this process, now this process is just going to execute the stored procedure, and it's going to do two things as part of our initial definition, which is it's going to update the first name of the specific employee, and it is also going to get me the total number of the rows within that specific table at any point in time. So let's see if our process does both of these things. Now opening up my SQL client here, you could see that I have only 3 rows of data here, and as part of our stored procedure, I'm going to be updating the first name of the employee ID 252 to an value that I provide as part of an input. And since we have 3 rows, you're going to be seeing an output of 3 when I'm executing the process, as that's what our output is supposed to calculate. Now let's check at the runtime. Here is the URL of my process. So as soon as you click on publish, it's going to give you a URL, what it's supposed to invoke. Here is the URL. And since my process takes first name as the input, I need to specify what I need to give as a first name. And subsequently, this first name will be sent to the stored procedure as part of the input to the SQL statement. That's it. So here you go. Okay, so I received an output SQL value of 3, which is as expected because I have 3 rows here. And when going back to my table, I refresh and I should find the first name as being what I set as part of the input, which is the test file. Anytime you need to check if something failed or what was the exact data that needs to be passed, that was passed at runtime, you would have to come to the monitor and check for the active process listing and open the process to start debugging it. That's pretty much it that I wanted to cover as part of the invocation of a stored procedure using data access service. I hope this was informational. We would love to hear your feedback, so you could please provide your feedback to the email addresses listed here, and also comment on Twitter if you need to do so. Thank you.